Now in this case, as you know, the container manages the transaction. It begins and commits the transactions. However, it does provide us certain attributes by which we can tweak the behavior of those transactions. Now let's study those attributes which help in tweaking the transactions in CMT. So first of all, let's remove this line or change the type to container. Okay, this is as good as removing this line off. Then let's specify the transaction attribute. So these are the attributes. So let's study each of these attributes in detail. So here are the 6 attributes. So the client side means anybody who can inject the EJB. So before we understand these attributes, let me show you a client with the bean. So go to the application. So basically this is your bean, and as usual this is our client. So the bean can specify some attribute over here. Let's say requires new. Okay, and this is our client. Now the first attribute is required. Required means that whether the client executes in a transaction or without a transaction, the EJB always has to execute in a transaction. For example, if the client is in a transaction, EJB uses that same transaction. Whereas if the client is without a transaction, EJB creates a new transaction, because required means the transaction should always exist. Now requires new means the EJB method annotated with this transaction should always execute in a new transaction. So if a client is in a transaction, the EJB suspends that transaction and creates a new transaction of its own. And if the client is without a transaction, EJB creates a new transaction. So always it's going to use a new transaction whether or not there is a transaction started by the client. Now mandatory means the transaction is required. If a client is in a transaction, then the EJB uses that transaction. But however, if client is without a transaction, then the EJB throws an exception. So it's mandatory for this case to start a transaction. Now never is exactly opposite of mandatory. Never means the method shouldn't be executing the transaction. So if a client starts a transaction, then EJB throws an exception. And when a client starts without a transaction, the EJB method runs without a transaction. Just like these two were pairs, these two are in pair. This is a slightly less harsher form of this, and this is slightly a less harsher form of this. So let's see supports. So if a client starts in a transaction, EJB uses that transaction. Whereas if a client doesn't have any transaction, the EJB doesn't use any transaction. So basically it doesn't give an exception, but it just executes without a transaction. Now, a EJB method or a class marked with non-supported means that if a client starts in a transaction or without a transaction, the method annotated with not supported is not going to run in a transaction. So as you can see, mandatory and supports are very similar, but when the client is without a transaction, EJB throws an exception. Client is without a transaction, EJB executes without a transaction. And over here, these two are very similar. So in this case, if it starts in a transaction, it throws an exception. Over here, if it starts in a transaction, it executes without a transaction. So required is the default transaction if you do not mention any attributes. So by default, we use container managed transaction, and by default, all the methods are marked with required. Out of all of this, only the first two, required and requires new, have a potential of starting the transaction. If you look at all of these, they don't start or stop a transaction, they just support it or do not support it. Now let's understand the first case, which is required. So let's go to our IDE. So this is our client and this is going to be our EJB. Okay. By default, as I mentioned, all method in all our beans are executing a transaction. So a client over here, my main method is also executing a transaction. So basically, we'll see the first case where the client is in a transaction. Here, our client is also in a transaction. Now let's go to a bean and mention the attribute of required. So as I mentioned before, this is the default attribute. You do not have to mention it. By default, all methods are required, have a transaction attribute of required. So we are all set up for the first case where the client is in a transaction and the EJB is marked with required. Okay, now before we run this, let's remove this since we are going to use CMT. These attributes only apply to CMT, not BMT. So remove this. Okay, now let's save and run the application. There is nothing different from what we have seen before. So let's run it. And let's refresh this, and here's the output, the last record. So for the second case, when the client is without a transaction, the EJB creates a new transaction with required attribute. So required means the transaction is always there on the method it's annotated with. So let's see that example. So over here, by default, we know that CMT is going to be present and this method is going to exist in a transaction. To stop that, I have put transaction management and type is bean. So when I say that, I have to manually begin and commit the transaction, which I'm not doing over here. So basically, this client is executing without a transaction. So over here, the attribute is required. So now let's run the application. We basically simulated this. The client is without a transaction because we used bean manage transaction and we didn't begin or commit the transaction. So the client is without a transaction and the bean is marked with required. And if you see the workbench, you refresh it, and here you can see the required monitor lizard, because that's what I mentioned over here. So even though our client didn't start a transaction, our method ran in a transaction because the attribute is required, and required means even if the client is not in a transaction, one transaction is started and the method is run in that transaction. Now requires new is very similar to required. Only thing is the method always runs in new transaction. Whether the client starts a transaction or whether the client executes without a transaction, always the method marked with requires new will be run in a new transaction. So let's see an example. So our client is going to start a transaction. I just commented this out. That means CMT comes into existence and this method runs in a transaction. So we are planning for this case. The client is in a transaction and then the EJB is marked with, instead of required, requires new. So let me change a bit over here and let's save and run this application. And here's the output of requires new when the client doesn't start a transaction or when the client needs a transaction. The next case is client is without a transaction and the EJB is marked with requires new. So only thing we have to change is we have to uncomment this out. So bean means you have to manually start and commit the transaction, which we aren't doing. So basically the client is not executing in the transaction and it's calling a method with requires new. So let's save and run this application. I have changed this to requires new too, and here's the output. Now mandatory means the client should always be in a transaction before executing this method. If the client is in a transaction, the method marked with mandatory runs with that same transaction. If the client is without a transaction, an exception is thrown. So let's see an example. So let's first of all comment this out, meaning now this method is in a transaction, the client is in a transaction. Then over here, let's change the attribute to mandatory and save and run the application. Before that, let's make it and over here. Okay, clear, run. And here's the output. Now let's understand the second case when the client is without a transaction. The mandatory attributed method has to throw an exception. Let's see that. So in our tester method, let's uncomment this out. By uncommenting this, we have to manually start and stop the transaction, which we aren't doing. So basically the client method isn't in a transaction and it's calling a method with an attribute of mandatory. So let's save and run. Hopefully get an exception. So we got an exception saying transaction required local exception. Now let's understand the next case, which is never. Never means the method shouldn't be executed within a transaction. If the client starts a transaction, then the method attributed with never will throw an exception. If the client executes without an exception, the method executes without a transaction. So let's see an example. So over here, let's first run the client in a transaction. So let's comment this out. By commenting this out, CMT comes into play, and because of CMT, each method runs in a transaction. So right now the client is in a transaction, and let's make this never. So we should get an exception, right? Let's run. Let's clear this out. And we got an exception. EJB cannot be invoked in a global transaction. Let's study the next case. When the client is without any transaction, the EJB marked with never will execute without any transaction. You won't give out any exceptions. Let's see this case. So over here, let's uncomment this out. So BMT comes into play, and there is no, we haven't manually started or ended a transaction, so the client isn't in the transaction, and it's calling a method annotated with never. So let's save, run the example. Now you'll be surprised that you get an exception. Why is that? Because as we had mentioned in JPA, except the read operation, all the operations must be performed in a transaction. By marking this as never, this never executes within a transaction, and because persist requires a transaction, we get an error. The error is transaction required exception. Let's understand the next case, which is support. So supports basically means if the client is in a transaction, the EJB method very well runs in that same transaction. But if the client is without a transaction, the EJB method runs without a transaction. It doesn't give an exception like mandatory. So it's slightly a less harsher form of mandatory. So let's see an example. Let's make the client running a transaction. So comment this out. Now transaction comes into play when this method is run. Because CMT is the default, then you call a method annotated with supports, and let's support. Okay, now let's save and run this example, and let's check the workbench, and let's see the output. So here's the output. Let's see the next use case. When the client executes without a transaction, the EJB also executes without a transaction. It doesn't give exception like mandatory. So let's see an example. So let's make this bean so that no transaction is started when this method is run, because we aren't manually beginning and committing the transaction. The client is now without a transaction. Go over here, and that's it. Let's save and run this example. And again we get an exception because transaction is required. In the CRUD operations, except R, that is read, all operations require to be in a transaction. And because the client didn't start a transaction, the method is run without a transaction, and persist gave an exception. Now let's see the last use case, which is not supported. So whether the client starts in a transaction or without a transaction, the EJB method will always run without a transaction. So from this only you can understand that if this method is going to run without a transaction, you are going to get an error from here, right? Because persist requires to be in a transaction. Just for showcasing it, so let the client start in a transaction, because CMT comes into play and this method runs in a transaction. And then let's change it to not supported, and we are expecting the same error, transaction required exception, right? Let's save and run this example, and here's the exception because transaction is required for persist. Now let's go for the very last example, that is the client without a transaction, the EJB executes without a transaction. So over here, let's go for BMT, and since we haven't manually started a transaction, this method runs without the transaction. And let's save and run the example. The same exception we are going to get, because this method is not going to run in a transaction and this method is going to give the error, right? Let's run. So here's the same exception again.